March 19, 1945. Combined Operations Headquarters, London. Underground Command Center, 21:47 hours. 6 officers stood around a map table. The room smelled of tobacco smoke and damp concrete. Overhead lights cast hard shadows across the topographical charts spread before them. A clock on the wall ticked audibly in the stillness. No one spoke. 3 telephone lines ran to the table. 2 were silent. The third had gone dead 30 seconds earlier. The brigadier's hand still rested on the receiver he had just replaced. His face showed nothing. The other officers watched him. No one moved. On the table, red pins marked German coastal positions along the Dutch coast. Blue pins marked Allied naval units positioned offshore. Yellow markers indicated civilian population centers. A grease pencil line showed a proposed bombardment zone. The line had been drawn 20 minutes earlier. It had not been erased. The brigadier's hand remained on the telephone. Outside the room, beyond the reinforced door, typists worked at their desks. Messengers moved through corridors. The machinery of command continued. Inside the room, everything had stopped. The officers waited. The clock ticked. The phone did not ring again. No one gave an order. No one asked a question. The silence held. The Combined Operations Headquarters coordinated joint actions between British naval and ground forces. This particular command center, located 30 meters below street level, served as the planning hub for coastal operations. The officers present represented naval gunfire support, intelligence liaison, civil affairs, and operational command. They had assembled at 20:15 hours for a final coordination meeting. The meeting concerned Operation Reservoir, a planned naval bombardment of German defensive positions on Walcheren Island. The positions threatened Allied supply lines through the Scheldt estuary. German artillery observers stationed in concrete bunkers along the coast had been directing fire against Allied shipping for 2 weeks. 12 ships had been damaged. Supply convoys were being rerouted, causing delays. The situation required resolution. Intelligence had confirmed that 3 major observation posts occupied reinforced positions along a 4-kilometer coastal stretch. Standard procedure called for destroyer-class naval guns to engage such positions with high-explosive shells. 2 destroyers, HMS Cavalier and HMS Carysfort, were positioned 12 kilometers offshore. Fire missions had been prepared. Coordinates had been verified. Weather conditions were acceptable. Visibility was predicted to remain clear through the night. The operation had been approved by higher command 48 hours earlier. Final authorization had been transmitted to the war room at 20:00 hours. The bombardment was scheduled to commence at 22:00 hours, 13 minutes from the moment the phone had gone silent. All preparations were complete. Gun crews aboard both destroyers had been at their stations for 20 minutes. Ammunition was loaded. Range was set. The targets were fixed positions. No variables remained. The civilian population on Walcheren had been warned via leaflet drops and radio broadcasts to evacuate coastal areas. Intelligence estimated that most civilians had already left the bombardment zone. The remaining population was believed to be minimal, perhaps 24 individuals in scattered farmhouses. The assessment was that military necessity outweighed residual civilian risk. This assessment had been documented and approved at divisional level. The officers in the war room had reviewed these details multiple times. No questions remained about the tactical situation or the operational plan. The meeting at 20:15 had been procedural, a final confirmation before execution. Then the telephone had rung at 21:46 hours. The brigadier had answered it. He had listened for approximately 45 seconds. He had said nothing during that time. He had replaced the receiver without speaking, and the room had gone silent. British naval gunfire doctrine in 1945 was well established. Destroyers carried 4 7-inch guns capable of firing 15-pound shells at ranges exceeding 15 kilometers. Against fixed coastal positions, the procedure was direct fire at designated coordinates. Each destroyer would fire a ranging salvo, adjust based on observed impacts, then commence fire for effect. Expected duration, 30 minutes per target. Total operation time, approximately 2 hours. The officers present had all participated in similar operations. The naval liaison officer had coordinated shore bombardments during the Normandy landings. The intelligence officer had assessed target priorities in the Channel Islands campaign. The civil affairs officer had managed civilian evacuation procedures in Belgium. They knew the process. They understood the timing. They expected the operation to proceed as planned. Standard protocol required final verbal confirmation from this headquarters before destroyers opened fire. The confirmation was to be transmitted via secure naval communications at 21:55 hours, 8 minutes before the scheduled start. The confirmation message had been written and was ready for transmission. The communications officer stood beside the radio equipment, waiting for the brigadier's order to send. Expectation in the room was clear. The brigadier would give the order. The message would be transmitted. The destroyers would commence firing at 22:00 hours. The German positions would be destroyed or sufficiently damaged to prevent further effective observation. Allied shipping would face reduced threat. The Scheldt supply route would become more secure. The operation would be logged as a successful fire mission. This was how such operations proceeded. The civilian risk had been acknowledged and accepted. War necessitated such calculations. The German positions were legitimate military targets. Their elimination served operational necessity. The presence of civilians in a combat zone was regrettable but did not alter the military requirement. This reasoning had been documented in the operational orders. It reflected established practice in coastal warfare. Every officer in the room understood these facts. They had been trained in target selection, proportionality assessment, and operational decision-making. They knew that commanders faced such choices regularly. The choices were made based on military criteria, approved through proper channels, and executed according to doctrine. This operation had followed all required procedures. It was ready to proceed. The only requirement was the brigadier's confirmation order. The room waited for that order to be given. The brigadier lifted his hand from the telephone. He did not speak. He looked at the map. His eyes moved across the yellow markers, the civilian population centers. He had seen those markers for 2 days. They had not changed. The locations had not moved. The assessment had not changed. Everything was as it had been. He looked at the clock. 21:48, 7 minutes until the required confirmation, 12 minutes until the scheduled bombardment. The naval liaison officer shifted his weight slightly. The movement was barely perceptible. No one else moved. The brigadier's eyes returned to the map, to the red pins, to the blue pins, to the grease pencil line. He reached for the grease pencil. His hand stopped before touching it. He withdrew his hand. He looked at the communications officer. The communications officer stood ready at the radio equipment, message in hand, waiting for the order to transmit. The brigadier opened his mouth. No words came. He closed his mouth. He looked at the map again. His hand moved to his jacket pocket. He removed a cigarette case. He opened it. He closed it without taking a cigarette. He returned it to his pocket. 21:49. The brigadier turned away from the table. He walked 3 paces to the wall. He stood facing the wall. His hands were at his sides. His shoulders were level. He did not move. The officers at the table did not move. The communications officer did not move. The room remained silent. Time expanded. The clock mechanism seemed louder. Each tick was distinct. 21:50, 21:51. The confirmation message was supposed to be transmitted at 21:55. 5 minutes remained, then 4, then 3. No order had been given. The naval liaison officer glanced at the intelligence officer. The intelligence officer's expression showed nothing. Both men looked at the brigadier's back. He stood facing the wall, unmoving. His posture gave no indication of what he might be thinking. His silence provided no guidance. The communications officer checked his equipment unnecessarily. The radio was functioning. The message was ready. The transmission would take 15 seconds once ordered. He looked at his watch. 21:52, 3 minutes until scheduled transmission. He looked at the brigadier. The brigadier had not turned around. A messenger entered the room carrying a folder. He approached the table, saw the stillness, and stopped. He held the folder but did not speak. The intelligence officer gestured slightly, "Wait outside." The messenger backed out of the room quietly. The door closed. The interruption had lasted perhaps 5 seconds. The silence resumed. 21:53. The brigadier turned from the wall. He walked back to the table. He looked at the map again. His hand moved toward the telephone. His fingers stopped an inch from the receiver. He did not pick it up. He withdrew his hand. He looked at the clock. 21:54. 1 minute until scheduled transmission. 6 minutes until scheduled bombardment. The officers waited. Their training had prepared them for many scenarios. It had not prepared them for this. An operation had been approved. Assets were in position. Timing was critical. The commander was present. The order should be given. The order was not being given. No explanation was offered. The situation had no clear protocol. 21:55. The scheduled transmission time arrived. The communications officer looked at the brigadier. The brigadier looked at the map. He did not look at the communications officer. He did not speak. The transmission was not sent. The moment passed. 21:56. The confirmation was now overdue. Aboard the destroyers, gun crews would be wondering. The timing was being compromised. Still no order came. The brigadier picked up the telephone receiver. He held it to his ear. He listened. The line was dead. No call was coming through. He had not dialed. He was simply holding the receiver, listening to silence on a dead line. 30 seconds passed. He replaced the receiver. He looked at the clock. 21:57. The telephone call at 21:46 had come from a Dutch liaison officer attached to the civil affairs section. The officer had been stationed in Middelburg, coordinating with resistance networks. His message had been brief and procedural. New information had reached him from sources in the bombardment zone. The evacuation had not been complete. A significant civilian population remained in the target area. The estimate was no longer 24 individuals. The estimate was now between 200 and 300. The information could not be verified independently in the time available. The resistance sources were considered reliable but not infallible. The Dutch liaison officer had reported the information as received, without assessment or recommendation. He had stated facts as they were known to him. He had not requested any specific action. He had simply provided updated intelligence. The call had ended. The brigadier had received this information 13 minutes before the scheduled bombardment. He had not shared it with the other officers. He had not discussed it. He had made no visible decision. He had simply placed the receiver down and had not given the order to transmit the confirmation message. The military necessity remained unchanged. The German observation post still threatened Allied shipping. The operation still served its tactical purpose. The approval from higher command remained valid. The resources were committed. The timing was critical. All original justifications persisted. What had changed was one data point. An estimate. 24 had become 200. The calculation had shifted. The assessment of proportionality had been based on one set of numbers. Those numbers were now different. Whether the new numbers were accurate was unknown. Whether they would have changed the original approval was unknown. The time available to verify or to request new guidance was insufficient. The brigadier had not made a formal decision to cancel the operation. He had not countermanded existing orders. He had not contacted higher command to request clarification. He had simply not given the confirmation that was required for the operation to proceed. By not acting, he had prevented the action. The method was passive. The effect was absolute. At 21:58, 2 minutes before the scheduled bombardment, the destroyers offshore would have been wondering about the absence of confirmation. Standard procedure allowed for brief delays due to communications issues, but the window was closing. Without confirmation, gun crews would stand down. The operation would not proceed. The decision would be made by default, by silence, by the absence of an order that should have been given but was not. At 22:03, 3 minutes after the scheduled bombardment time, the brigadier spoke for the first time since the phone call. He addressed the communications officer. Transmit to naval units. Operation Reservoir postponed pending further intelligence assessment. Maintain current positions. Await new orders. The communications officer transmitted the message. Acknowledgments came back from both destroyers within 2 minutes. The gun crews stood down. The operation was suspended. The war room remained quiet. The brigadier rolled up the map showing the bombardment zone. He placed it in a tube. He handed it to the intelligence officer. File this pending review. The intelligence officer took the tube and left the room. The naval liaison officer gathered his papers. The civil affairs officer closed his folder. No questions were asked. No explanations were given. The meeting was over. Officers departed one by one. Within 10 minutes, the room was empty except for the brigadier and one aide. The brigadier sat at the table. He did not speak. The aide stood by the door waiting for instructions. None came. After 5 minutes, the brigadier stood, put on his cap, and left the room. The aide followed. The door closed. The operation was recorded in the daily log as Op Reservoir postponed 2,200 HRS pending intel review. No amplifying information was included. The log entry occupied one line. No follow-up was scheduled. No new intelligence assessment was formally requested. The operation simply did not proceed. Time moved forward. Other operations continued. The moment passed. The Dutch liaison officer who had made the phone call was not contacted again that night. His report entered the intelligence files. It was not marked urgent. It was not flagged for verification. It was filed with other routine intelligence updates. The civilian population estimate it contained was not independently confirmed. The operation that had been postponed was not rescheduled. The German observation posts remained operational for another 11 days before being overrun by advancing ground forces. The threat they posed was eventually eliminated by different means. No ships were bombarded during those 11 days. Whether this was connected to the suspended operation was not documented. No analysis was conducted comparing the operational cost of the postponement against the civilian casualties that might have occurred. The calculation was never made because the data to make it was never gathered. The operation existed in planning documents and in one line of a daily log. It existed nowhere else. No investigation was conducted into the suspension of Operation Reservoir. No report was filed explaining the decision. No superior officer questioned the brigadier about why the confirmation order was not given. The operation had been approved but not executed. Such things happened in war. Conditions changed. Timing became unfavorable. Resources were redirected. Operations were postponed routinely. This one was postponed. That was all. The daily log entry was the only official record. The entry indicated postponement pending intel review. No review was ever documented. No updated intelligence assessment appeared in subsequent files. The operation was not mentioned again in any accessible records. It disappeared from the operational tempo. Other priorities emerged. The war continued. The moment was forgotten administratively within days. The Dutch liaison officer's report remained in the files, but was not referenced in any later assessments. The estimate of 200 to 300 civilians in the bombardment zone was neither confirmed nor refuted. No post-operation investigation determined the actual civilian presence in the area. The ground forces that eventually overran the German positions did not conduct civilian casualty assessments. The question of how many people had been in the target zone on March 19, 1945, remained unanswered. The officers who had been in the war room that night did not discuss what had occurred. Military culture discouraged such discussions. Orders were followed or not followed. Operations proceeded or did not proceed. The reasons belonged to commanders. The execution belonged to subordinates. The silence in the room had been observed by 6 officers. It was not mentioned in any letters, diaries, or memoirs that have been preserved. The absence of action left no trace because absences are not documented. The bombardment that did not occur left no craters, no damage reports, no casualty lists. The civilians who may or may not have been in the target zone continued their lives unaware that they might have been at risk. The gap between what was planned and what occurred was visible only to those in the room, and they did not speak of it. The brigadier continued in his command position through the end of the European War. He participated in the planning for several subsequent operations. His service record shows competent performance and standard progression through the ranks. He retired in 1954 with the rank of Major General. He died in 1968. His obituary mentioned his wartime service but listed no specific operations. Operation Reservoir was not among his documented achievements because it had not occurred. The Dutch liaison officer returned to civilian life in the Netherlands after the war. He worked in municipal administration in Zeeland province. He married and raised a family. In a 1983 interview for a local history project, he mentioned his wartime liaison work but provided no specific anecdotes. He was asked if he had been involved in any operations that had directly affected civilian safety. He said he had made reports about civilian locations when he became aware of them. He did not mention any specific incidents. He died in 1991. The naval liaison officer who had been present in the war room remained in the Royal Navy. He served in various staff positions and retired as a captain in 1960. His personal papers, donated to a naval museum, include some wartime correspondence but no references to March 19, 1945 or to Operation Reservoir. He died in 1979. The other officers present that night followed similar trajectories: military careers, retirements, deaths. None left records indicating they remembered or discussed the evening when a bombardment was suspended after a phone call. The moment existed in their experience, but not in their documented histories. The civilian population in the target area on Walcheren Island experienced German occupation, eventual liberation by Canadian forces, and post-war reconstruction. Local histories mention artillery exchanges and military operations in the region. They do not mention a planned bombardment that did not occur in March 1945. There was nothing to mention. Nothing had happened. The absence of an event cannot be commemorated. The German observation posts that were the original targets continued functioning until overrun. Their presence in the war diary entries for March 1945 is noted. Their eventual capture is documented. The fact that they were scheduled for naval bombardment on March 19, but were not bombarded, does not appear in any German records either. From their perspective, it was simply another night when they were not attacked. Such nights were common. This one was not special. March 19, 1945 was one night among many in the final months of the war in Europe. Thousands of operations were planned. Some were executed, some were canceled, some were postponed. The distinction between canceled and postponed was often administrative. Operation Reservoir was logged as postponed. It was never resumed. The practical effect was the same as cancellation, but the formal status was different. A phone call had provided new information. A commander had received that information. The commander had not given an order. The operation had not proceeded. The causal chain was simple. The documentation was minimal. The consequences were unknown because what did not happen cannot be measured against what might have happened. The war room had gone silent after one unexpected call. The silence had held for 17 minutes. In that silence, no confirmation was given, no message was sent, no guns fired, no shells fell, no impact was recorded. The night passed. The war continued. The moment dissolved into the vast accumulation of moments that constitute military operations. Most moments are unremarkable. This one appeared unremarkable in the records. Only the 6 officers who had watched the clock and waited for an order that never came knew that something had occurred. And what had occurred was nothing. The title of the operation, Reservoir, meant a storage place, a reserve, something held back. The operation itself became its title, something held back, something reserved, something that remained in planning and never entered reality. The files contain the plan. The files do not contain the execution. The gap between the two is silent. The war room went silent. The record went silent. The memory went silent. And the silence holds still.